Tejasvinavadhitam astu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May we be protected together. May we be nourished together. May we acquire strength together. May our learning shine forth in our lives. May we not find fault with one another. Om, peace, peace, peace. So we are continuing with Swami Vivekananda's Karma Yoga. And this is the third beginner's class in Karma Yoga. It's interesting and this is, of course, we're now in the 3rd of January, 1896. It's cold, it's New York, 228 West 39th Street. And all of Swamiji's classes are being given at this location. And I just looked it up. There's this wonderful document called Swami Vivekananda in the West, a chronology. It's a big spreadsheet, which has been released as a PDF document. I believe it's available on our website for download. And every day that Swami Vivekananda is in the West, it tells where he's staying and what he did. And there are a few days where it's unknown, but almost every day is accounted for, where he was on the train or in New York or in Chicago or wherever he was. And this is interesting that the Karma Yoga classes were on Friday. Morning was the advanced classes, evening was the beginners classes. Jnana Yoga was on Wednesdays, same model. Morning was advanced classes, evening was beginners classes. Raja Yoga was on Saturdays, morning and evening, same. And Mondays was Bhakti Yoga. So he was concurrently teaching all 4 yogas. Plus he was giving lectures on other days. Sundays were generally lectures. And interesting to note that on the 9th of February, he started speaking on Sundays. Before that, he was speaking at Hardman Hall or something like that. Maybe he needed a bigger place. He was speaking in the concert hall at Madison Square Garden with a capacity of 1,500 people. And at least on Sunday, February 9th, it was sold out. The hall was full. So 1,500 people had come to hear Swami Vivekananda. So he was extremely active at this time. Now, as we know, he gave only 8 classes in Karma Yoga, 4 advanced classes and 4 beginners classes, and we're reading them in this order. The first reading the 4 beginners classes, and then we'll read the 4 advanced classes. But it's not how he gave them, so it might be interesting to read it both ways. Next time, maybe read it in the order that he delivered them. First advanced, first beginners, second advanced, second beginners. Because we'll see that the last class he gave, the 4th class for beginners, it also has a kind of a feeling of summing up everything. And another interesting point is that the last Karma Yoga class was delivered on January 10th. On February 23rd, just 5-6 weeks later, the book Karma Yoga was released in New York. So he had a team of people working hard to edit and put these talks into publication. And also pamphlets were regularly being issued, were being published by the Vedanta Society of New York of his lectures. The lecture would be given, and then a week or 2 weeks later, a pamphlet would be printed and distributed. As these announcements would be made on the Sundays when he was giving a lecture to a large number of people. They would announce that now this pamphlet is available of such and such a lecture. So it was a period of intense activity. Hosea Goodwin was there with his amazing shorthand capabilities, his stenographic capabilities. So he was taking down all of Swamiji's talks and classes, and these were then immediately getting turned around and published beautifully. So that's a little bit about Swami Vivekananda in New York at this time, a very rich period of production. So today we will complete this third class. Each is great. We help ourselves, not the world. And though this is the central idea of the class, actually he doesn't spend that much time on this point. He has a lot of introductory material, and he takes a lot of digressions, some of which have been taken out of the final published version of Karma Yoga. As you may remember, we are reading the transcript, pretty much the direct transcript, which Sturdy published in London. So we get a little bit more of his meanderings through different ideas. But he starts, if we can just refresh, since it's been a couple of weeks, he starts with a discussion of religion and how every religion has three parts: a philosophy, and then mythology, and then a ritual, and that each religion has these three aspects. The philosophy is then embodied or in the mythology with stories about great men and women who embody the philosophy. And of course, one's own religion, we call it history, and the other religions, we call it mythology. Actually, it's all a mix. Yes, there's some history, but there's also quite a lot of mythology. And the older the religion is, the more mythology has crept in. But even, I have to say frankly, even in the stories about Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, sometimes we see that the stories are told, not maybe in the source books, but we hear people tell stories, and wait, it's not quite that way in the book. And if we go back to the book, we find, well, it wasn't quite that way. The mythology starts to grow. So even in our Vedanta tradition, when we look at the lives of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, we see a tendency to start mythologizing. So, but we are fortunate that so much historical material is still available to us, so we can go back and check and see. And Swami Vivekananda himself cautioned about this when he told his, in the rules for the order, he said only those teachings of Sri Ramakrishna that have been corroborated by his intimate disciples are to be accepted as valid. Because anybody can say, oh, the master told me this, the master told me that. So he specifically pointed out, let those intimate disciples who knew him well corroborate any teachings. And if they don't corroborate, then we won't accept it as genuine. All right, so, and then ritual, the philosophy made concrete. And remember, we discussed how our puja is precisely this. The way we conduct our worship ritual is precisely putting the abstract philosophy into concrete form. Now, of course, Swami Vivekananda is going to say that as ritual is karma, he can also extend it that everything we do can be done as a ritual. And that's the idea behind Karma Yoga, that everything we do is worship. Everything we do is an offering to the divine. And then he takes a few little seeming digressions. He talks about symbols and their universality, and how we think in symbols, using word symbols. And this connection between word and idea, he touches on that, which is a whole area of philosophy in itself, and the power of the word, which he also calls part of Karma Yoga, how much power words have. And he gives the example of how you give one word to a man, and he comes and he punches you in the nose. Why? That's the power of the word. Or on the other hand, someone is weeping and broken down, and someone simply comes and says a few gentle words, and they recover their peaceful mind. And then he brings in this central idea of this class, which is, he asks, why do good to the world? Why do good to the world? Apparently to help the world, but really to help ourselves. That's this fundamental idea. And then he discusses a lot about helping the world. Can we help the world? And he concludes that actually we cannot. We cannot help the world. It seems like we can. And he comes again and again to this idea that we ought to try to help the world. That's the highest motive, to try to do good to others, to try to help others. That's the greatest motive we have in life, the highest motive, the highest ideal. And yet, at the same time, we cannot help the world. says Swami Vivekananda. And so this seems paradoxical, and this paradox, maybe it's at the heart of Swami Vivekananda's own personal life as well. Because on the one hand, he had this tremendous calling to help the world, to deliver his message. And on the other hand, had this sense of the futility of it, that how can you help the world? It's simply because this idea that we have that we can make this world perfect is false. It is impossible. We cannot make the world perfect. We cannot make everything here beautiful and perfect, and that delusion is actually propelling most of what we do in the world. And politics, all the craziness that we see right now going on in politics, everybody thinks that their idea will make the world perfect. If we can only do this and this and this, everything will be good. And if we allow all the immigrants to come, or we ban all immigrants from coming, depending on which philosophy you follow, this country will be a perfect country. And this is a delusion. It's false. So then why do good to the world? On the one hand, it's from that tremendous heart of sympathy that Swami Vivekananda is compelled to try to help people, to uplift people, to help. And at the same time recognizing, actually, who is helped most? We are helped ourselves when we try to do that. We grow in unselfishness, we grow in love, we grow in sympathy, and gradually we outgrow our limited self and realize our oneness with humanity. And only then, when we realize our oneness, can we truly help others. Krishna has a question.
So in that aspect, it feels like some political stand can be more sympathetic than others. Right? Even though nothing's going to change, no political stand is going to change anything. But some political stand can be more sympathetic than others. Right? Even if it doesn't do anything, just subscribe to that.
Well, here's the question. Some political stands may have more sympathy than others. Well, politics, Swami Vivekananda wanted nothing to do with politics. Only once in all of his works have I read any statement relating to politics. And I can't quote it exactly, if one of you remembers, something along the lines of, I suppose I am a socialist because half a loaf of bread is better than no bread at all. Something like that. That's the only time he ever made any comment that seems to suggest some kind of political philosophy. Actually, his attitude was, and he made it explicit in his rules for the order, in the rules for the Ramakrishna order, that the great lack in society, all the problems that we see in the world, in society, can be traced to two root causes: lack of education and lack of spirituality. And so that was his call, to bring education and spirituality. First education and then spiritual. Well, both could be seen as education. Secular education and then spiritual education. That this was what he felt is the call of the order, the Ramakrishna order, is to bring education to those who need it. And once we become educated, once people become educated, we can solve our problems, we can solve our difficulties. It's not for him to dictate, oh, you should all be arrange society in this way. Let the people arrange everybody arrange society, but this education is essential. And that we still see is sorely lacking in the world. And then spirituality, because when we have true spirituality, then we start to feel for others, then we start to feel called to genuinely try to help others and not just be selfish. But then he's going to get on, in today, he's going to get a lot into fanaticism. And we already touched on it in the last class, how much harm fanaticism does in the world, and how many workers in this world become fanatics, and how we see in politics also, now more than ever, we get fanatics. It's a lot of fanaticism in politics, and very little true helping. So I think we salute politics from a distance. And true, we have to find that political philosophy which, if we are going to be in the world, those of us who are active in the world, yes, we have a civic duty to vote and how to, which politics will match with our Vedanta philosophy if we're ardent Vedantists. It's very difficult to say. We don't see much spirituality being reflected in any of the politics being espoused today. Green Party. I don't know much about the Green Party. Well, they're certainly defending environment. And that's why they're called green, right? Or do they also have do they have a spiritual? A lot of the most progressive, what we would call progressive political persuasions, which seem to emphasize sympathy for the poor and those kind of things, but they don't have any spirituality. That is their spirituality, but they don't have any sense of, they're mostly materialists, I think. And so it's a very complicated thing. It's a mess. It's a big mess. So our calling as Vedanta students is to call upon the sleeping soul and see how it awakes, to remind people through our lives especially, and through our teaching perhaps, that there is a higher dimension to life, that our true nature is not a physical, our true nature is spiritual. And then other things fall into place when that comes. But that seems like it's still a long ways off. Swami Vivekananda came to deliver this message. So, and there was an interesting remark that he made in his. There's so many rich remarks that we haven't touched all of them. But one that he makes is, each person makes a world for him or herself. We make our own world as we experience this world, and we think it's an objective thing, but actually it's very subjective. We each, though no doubt we see a lot of suffering in this world. There are people who are subjected to tremendous suffering, and Vivekananda would always feel for those who are suffering and want to bring them out of suffering. Ultimately, the only solution for suffering is spiritual realization, to know that we are spirit, that we are pure consciousness, that we are infinite joy by our very nature. What a powerful and amazing message. And yet, of course, at the same time, Sri Ramakrishna would say, and Swami Vivekananda repeated that, religion is not for an empty stomach. You can't teach a starving person about their true nature as spirit. They're not, we're too bound in the body when we're starving. So the first duty is feed people who are hungry, and then teach them how to feed themselves, and then they can be ready for spiritual teachings. So this is the but back to this idea of helping the world. This is the kind of push and pull, that on the one hand, the highest motive power is to do good to others, and at the same time, it is foolish to think that we can actually help others. And then, interestingly, he brings in God, and he says, it's God's world. God doesn't need your help. I think that was a common refrain among the Christian preachers of those days, of the 1890s in America. Come, help God. God needs your help. Right? Sri Ramakrishna would laugh at such a thing. What? God needs your help? You're going to help God? God is infinite. The divine is the infinite reality by whose will everything is unfolding. And you're going to help? God needs your help? He will remember that preacher of the Brahmo Samaj who said, God is dry. You have to sweeten God with your love and devotion. And Sri Ramakrishna was stunned to hear about this. He said, what? Obviously, this preacher has never even got an inkling of God, has never come even close to knowing God, because God is the very essence of bliss. And to say that God is dry, so why should we listen to such a fool? So similarly, if you talk about helping God needing your help, what absolute absurdity. All right, and then finally he sums up the message of this this class as, One, the world does not owe us anything, rather we are debtors to the world. It is our privilege that we are granted the opportunity to serve others, to try to help others, to try to do good to others. That's a great privilege, and we must not expect anything in return for that. The giving, the doing is itself its greatest reward. Second, there is a God, there is a divine power, a Shakti, whom Swami Vivekananda called Kali in his private conversations, but only God in this public classes for the public. Three, do not hate, and four, no fanaticism. And it's this interesting. We'll read about a little more about he rails against fanaticism. And why does he talk about it so much? I thought, why is he getting so much into fanaticism in this class on karma yoga? And then it struck me that, well, it's because most people who try to do good in the world become fanatic. And most of the fanatics in the world are actually trying to do good to the world. They're trying to, and fanatics think that, well, my way is the best, is the true way of helping people. And he gives the examples of the temperance movement, the anti-alcohol movement, the anti-smoking movement, and people become fanatic, as if that will solve all the problems if we can just eliminate drinking. As if, like right now, it's the abortion thing. If we can just eliminate abortion, that will solve all the problems of the world. Or on the other side, both sides are fanatic, and they go so far as to cause harm. Both sides are bombing people and all that kind of nonsense. So where we left off last class is Swami Vivekananda says, when you have avoided fanaticism, then alone you will work. The fanatic does not work. It is the level-headed person, the calm person of good judgment and cool nerves, of great sympathy and love. All right, cool nerves. It is when we have cool nerves. And we think, oh, the anger is a great force for doing, right? We get angry, we feel fired up, we're going to do something, we're going to stop this terrible crime that's happening. But when we're angry like that, when our nerves are hot like that, we can't think clearly. We don't act, we don't have good judgment. It's sympathy and love, which are the great motive powers which actually propel us towards maybe doing a little good in this world. And then he points out that the fanatic has no sympathy. The fanatic has no sympathy, because fanaticism is mostly a kind of selfishness. It's what I do, I think that that's the best. And I want to impose that on everybody, as if everybody should be just like me. So I looked it up, fanatic. The definition from the 1520s, an insane person. From Latin, fanaticus, mad, enthusiastic, inspired by a god. And also furious, mad, originally pertaining to a temple. So fanaticism, the word from the beginning, is also associated with religion, interestingly. From phanum, temple, shrine, consecrated place. So phanum meant temple, shrine, and consecrated place, related to festus, which means festive. And then the meaning from the 1640s, we get the meaning a zealous person, a person affected by enthusiasm. And as an adjective, a fanatic in the 1530s, furious, or characterized by excessive enthusiasm, especially in religion, from the 1640s. And a beautiful definition attributed to Winston Churchill is, a fanatic is someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. Someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject, that's a fanatic. That's a very nice definition. All right. let's read a little more. Do you not remember in your own history, he's talking to Americans, in your own history how these Mayflower people came and began to call themselves Puritans? They were very pure and good as far as they went, until they began to persecute other people. And throughout the history of humanity, it is the same. Right? The Puritans came, as he says, so-called Puritans, they came fleeing persecution, religious persecution in Europe. And they came to America and established themselves as Puritans, and we're so pure and holy. And then anybody who's not pure and holy, they started to persecute. So this is, throughout the history of humanity, it is the same. I have read of 2 wonderful ships. The first was Noah's Ark, and the second, the Mayflower. The Jews say that out of Noah's Ark, all creation has come. Not only the Jews, but the so-called Old Testament. And the Americans say that out of the Mayflower, nearly half the people have come. I scarcely meet one who does not say, my grandfather or great-grandfather came out of the Mayflower. So in those days, I guess that was, even now, we don't hear it so much. But now and then you meet someone who said, oh yes, my forefathers were here since the beginning. But now we have all the more immigration from different parts of the world. But interesting that in those days it was considered a great pedigree if you could trace your lineage back to the Mayflower. We must therefore always remember that God Almighty has taken care of this universe, and we need not bother about it. It was interesting that he throws that in, because then he goes right back to fanaticism. So on the one hand, I think he's balancing these two. Don't be a fanatic. Look at how much fanaticism there is in this world. God is there. Don't be a fanatic. Let the divine will unfold. And yes, participate in it. Bring your life into harmony with the divine rhythm, with the rhythm, and be an instrument in the hands of the divine. But to think that by your fanaticism you're going to cure the ills of this world, this is a great mistake. When you are no longer a fanatic, there may come sympathy. So this true sympathy, this true feeling for others cannot be as long as there is fanaticism, says Swamiji here. In 90 cases out of 100, fanatics have bad livers, or are dyspeptics, or in some way diseased. By and by, physiologists will find out that fanaticism is a kind of disease. I have seen plenty of it. Lord, save me from it. He was actually surprised. When he came to this country, he was surprised at how much fanaticism there was here at the time. Because socially, well, he loved the social freedom of America. And he used to say that in India, society is completely bound. And yet, in religion, it is completely free. And he admired that freedom of society. Let people grow according to their own law of growth in social matters. And yet he saw that in spiritual matters, in religion, Americans were totally bound by this kind of fanaticism. In 1894, he wrote, in one letter he wrote about America, in religion, they practice here either hypocrisy or fanaticism. So it's rather pathetic that it's a disease. And so many fights he had to really fight against the kind of narrow-minded bigotry and fanaticism that was prevalent. My experience has become condensed in this form, that you should rather keep away from all sorts of fanatical reforms. This world is slowly going on, and let it go slowly. Why are you in a hurry? Have a good sleep and keep your nerves in good order. Eat nice food and have sympathy with the world. Fanatics only make hatred in the world. Interesting. Let things, rather than breaking, so many people in reforming want to move too fast. Swamiji seems to be suggesting here that moving too fast and thinking that we have the solution to the world's problems and break things. So that's, again, coming back to his idea that actually what we need is more spirituality, more education and spirituality. And say that famous quote, when, of course, when men were in charge of everything, and what to do for women. And he would say, am I a woman that I know what to do for women? Let them decide for themselves what they want, what they need. Give women education. He was strongly in favor of women's education, and that was in India when women would go to primary school, and that was it. Then you get married, and that's it. So Swamiji said, yes, let women have education, and then they will make the reforms that they need. Why should men make the reforms for women? So when we get true sympathy, then we can act correctly. Fanatics only make hatred in the world. Do you mean to say these fanatics love these poor fellows who become drunkards? They are simply fanatics because they want to get something out of it. As soon as the battle is done, they are for the spoil. They want something. They have no sympathy. And as soon as you come out of the company of fanatics, you will begin to love and to sympathize. And the more you get of this love and sympathy, the less will be the power of cursing these poor fellows. But you will sympathize rather with their faults. You will find by and by that you will come to sympathize with the drunkard and to know that he is a man or a woman like you, and how many circumstances there are dragging you down, and that if you had been in the case of that person, you might have committed suicide. We see even in the case of his father. Swamiji was actually somewhat of a fanatic as a boy, and it was his father who used to even give money to relatives who were squandering it away in drink. And his father would say, if you can relieve the suffering of someone even for a little while, what's the harm? That is that beautiful letter, and I collected it for a little quote. Yes, he writes, this was to Francis Leggett, Frankincense, as he used to call him. At 20 years of age, I was the most unsympathetic, uncompromising fanatic. He himself is admitting he was a fanatic at 20 years of age. A perfect example is Rakhal, his dear friend Rakhal, who became Swami Brahmananda, and Narendra. They both joined the Brahmo Samaj. Brahmo Samaj was somewhat fanatical in its iconoclasm. Image worship is all false. That's the kind of reform that Swamiji says is not good. It's this imposing. Image worship is bad. Nobody should go to a temple. If you join the Brahmo Samaj, you sign a pledge saying that you will not bow down before any image in a temple. So this Swami Vivekananda, Narendranath, and Rakhal both signed this pledge. Now, both started coming to Sri Ramakrishna. Rakhal, his innate devotional tendencies and temple tendencies were awakened or reawakened in the company of Sri Ramakrishna. And he began going to the Kali temple and bowing down before the image of the Divine Mother. And Narendranath saw this, and he scolded him. He said, what? You signed that pledge too? And Rakhal felt embarrassed. And so an uncomfortable situation arose between them, and they weren't talking to each other, though they were very close friends. They had been very close friends. They weren't talking to each other. So Swami Vivekananda acknowledges that, yes, he had this fanatical tendency. And then Sri Ramakrishna intervened and told Narendranath, see, Rakhal is different. He cannot follow these things. And of course, Swami Vivekananda ultimately also had to give up that fanaticism, and he realized that the Divine Mother is real and is full of grace. And that famous incident when he went to the temple of Mother Kali and under the instructions of Sri Ramakrishna to pray for money, and he couldn't do it. He found that Mother is all he could pray for was devotion and renunciation, and bowed his head down at her feet repeatedly. So his fanaticism was broken. But here in this letter to Francis Leggett, he says, at 20 years of age, I was the most unsympathetic, uncompromising fanatic. I would not walk on the footpath on the theater side of the streets in Calcutta. Footpath means sidewalk in America. he would not walk on the sidewalk on the theater side. Why? Because the theater was associated with bad tendencies, sinful tendencies, people who did not have good character. Actors and actresses were people of low character who were drinking and other things like that. So he wouldn't even walk on that side of the street. He'd cross to the other street, find another way to go. He's not going to walk by the theater. At 33, 13 years later, when he's writing this letter, I can live in the same house with prostitutes and never would think of saying a word of reproach to them. Is it degenerate? Or is it that I am broadening out into the universal love, which is the Lord himself? So this is, of course, the fact that he had expanded his heart so much that he couldn't say a word of reproach. That doesn't mean that he wasn't there to love any prostitutes living in his house. And this is the one amazing thing about this letter. As I did some research last time, this 39th Street, West 39th Street in New York, where his house, where this building is, 228 West 39th Street. This was known in the 1890s there were a lot of brothels on this street. So actually, there were prostitutes living on his street and possibly in his building when he's teaching karma yoga. So he's not speaking theoretically, actually. He says, at 33, I can live in the same house with prostitutes. And actually, he doesn't say it, but he was probably living in the same house with prostitutes and never would think of saying a word of reproach to them. Is it degenerate? Or is it that I am broadening out into the universal love, which is the Lord himself? So this is the kind of sympathy that comes when we, and it goes together. As we grow in sympathy, our fanaticism has to break. And as our fanaticism is breaking, we grow more in sympathy. Interesting account we got from one young man who stayed at our Trabuco monastery when I was there in the probably around 1998 or 9. Young man from Georgia who had been an evangelical Christian. And he had been sure that everyone who has not accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior will be going to hell after death. That was his conviction. He was raised in that tradition and steeped in it, and he was a fanatic. Let's face it, he was a fanatic. And I asked him, well, how did you, because he was a Vedantist now, how did you overcome that? And he said, what happened was he went on a trip, was it a trip with school perhaps, or with his church, to Turkey. And he saw the children of Turkey, Muslim children, no doubt, and how pure, and children have a purity about them. He saw these pure kids playing, and it struck his heart, how could these pure children, who happened to be born in Turkey, happened to be Muslim, how could they be consigned to hell forever simply because they don't accept Jesus? Now, that's what broke his fanaticism. Something broke inside, and he realized he couldn't accept this doctrine anymore. So it is sympathy for others, a feeling for others that can break this kind of fanaticism. The fanatic condemns someone who it gets addicted to drugs, whereas the saint recognizes that there, but for the grace of God go I, and tries to help the addict with love, which is the only power truly that can perhaps help anybody. And here he goes on a section, it gets pretty harsh. I remember one of these whose husband is a great drunkard, and she spoke to me of her husband becoming so. I replied, Madam, if there were 20 millions of wives like you, all husbands would become drunkards. So, kind of harsh. Of course, I'm sure he got a good laugh with that, and he's joking, but at the same time, the fanatic only sees one side of the picture. let's open our hearts wide enough to see the whole picture. Life is not such a joke as that. It is a little more serious. So he qualifies it after speaking like that. So then he's going to conclude this class with the following. I will ask you to remember the points I made. That we are debtors to this world. The world does not owe me anything. It is a great privilege that I am allowed to do anything for the world. This is the first point in his summation, which I already mentioned, that we are debtors. The world doesn't owe us anything. It is we who owe the world. And as we try to do good to others, it's a great mistake to expect something in return, because we are the ones who truly benefit from that. And it's true though, we do something for others and we expect at least a thank you, right? And we have been taught by our parents, say thank you. When someone does something, when someone does something for you, you should thank them. And so we begin to expect that. And as often as not, we get curses instead of thanks. It is a great privilege that I am allowed to do anything for the world. Remember, he gives the example of giving something to a beggar. Now, and we have that opportunity. We have now in Los Angeles many people asking for money all the time. And with what attitude, if we give anything at all, with what attitude do we give? Oh, here you are, you poor fellow, get away from me, but I'll give you a little money, but don't get away from me. Or is it, thank you for giving me this opportunity to give you something, to try to help you with something? Can we do it that way? Can we kneel before the beggar and offer our offering, make our offering? The second point to remember is that there is a God in this universe. It is not that this universe is drifting about and requiring help from you and me. He is ever present, undying, eternally active, and infinitely watchful. When the whole universe sleeps, he sleeps not. He is working incessantly. All the changes and manifestations of the world are his. We must remember this. This, of course, the mystic experience of Swami Vivekananda, to be continually aware of the presence of the divine, to be always conscious of God. We forget, and we start to think that we are so important and that this reform needs to be carried out because that will be a step towards saving the world. And Swami Vivekananda reminds us, there is a power behind that's working. There is the Divine Mother. All the changes and manifestations of the world are his. We must remember this. It's interesting how we get these in the life and teachings of Vivekananda, these different poles that he circulates, that he moves between. He moves between these different poles, and they're oftentimes paradoxical, and there's a certain tension between these two poles. Like on the one hand, exhorting us, human beings, to feel for others, to feel for the misery of the world, to be called to help. When we feel for the misery of others, what will we be called to do? Naturally to help them. If we feel that people are burning in misery, don't we want to help them? But mostly we don't feel it. If we genuinely feel, and at the same time, but you can't help the world. God is the doer. Divine Mother is doing everything. How can you help? And what is this world? On the one hand, it's just a gymnasium, or sometimes it's a circus. Gymnasium, circus. And we are the clowns tumbling. I'm laughing. Petra has worked in the circus. She's been a circus performer, so that's why we're having a good laugh. But yes, that's the beautiful. Do you know the story?
No.
Swami, it was in Camp Taylor in north of San Francisco in 1900. They went camping for 2 weeks and had a great time with Swami Vivekananda camping. What could be better? And they had their tents and they had a stove, and by there was a small river there. They would meditate on the banks of the river. And one morning, Mrs. Bell, I believe, said, "This world is a schoolhouse, an old schoolhouse where we come to learn our lessons." And Swami Vivekananda says, "Who told you that?" "Well, I don't know. I don't remember." "Well, I don't think so." "Well, what is it, Swamiji?" "This world is a circus, and we are clowns tumbling in it." "Why do we tumble, Swamiji?" "Because we like to. When we are tired, we will stop." So that idea of play, that spontaneity of this life. Can we play? Can we look on this life as a play? That we are just clowns tumbling? Very often he says he calls it a gymnasium, especially in his karma yoga classes. He calls it sometimes a moral gymnasium. And why are we here? To strengthen our muscles, to strengthen our moral muscles, to strengthen our spiritual muscles, to grow spiritually. But this idea of a schoolhouse, that we come here to learn our lessons, which is pretty common also, we can say, in the New Age circles and all of that, this idea of a schoolhouse, he rejected that outright. He much prefers the idea of a circus. We're here to play, and we're playing with the Lord. It's all mother playing, all manifestations of mother playing here. And sometimes the play hurts. Sometimes if we look on it as a dream, then sometimes it becomes a nightmare, a painful dream, but still a dream or a play. And Swamiji really likes this idea of play. Thirdly, we must not hate anyone, because this world will always remain this way, a mixture of good and evil, a grand gymnasium where we will take exercise and become stronger and stronger. So here he gives the gymnasium idea. This idea that actually this is a mix of good and evil, of so-called good and so-called evil. This pairs of opposites, we will always have it here. We can't have only good. Actually, it's an interesting philosophical problem. Can you imagine only good if you didn't have a thought of what is bad? Can you imagine in this world there could be only good and no bad? Would we call it good? If every food tasted delicious, would we know that it's delicious? Because we never tasted any bad food to know the difference. It's a philosophical question. You can think about that in this world. And moreover, what's good for me might be bad for you. So it's really difficult to say that there can be a perfect world. And we can't say it, and Swami Vivekananda reminds us, this world is a mixture of good and evil, a grand gymnasium where we will take exercise and become stronger and stronger. So that's the approach he's taking tonight. We're taking exercise in the world, and the more we grow in strength of detachment, strength of love, strength of sympathy. Fourthly, we must not be fanatics. Fanaticism is against all love. You hear fanatics glibly saying, "I do not hate the sinner, I hate the sin." And I've heard this said in college, the fanatical religionists, shall we say, the fanatical religionists. We don't hate the sinner, we hate the sin. I will go 200 miles to see the face of a man who can make a distinction between the sin and the sinner, says Swamiji. It is easy to say so, but try in your mind whether you can distinguish between the wicked man and his wickedness. You would be a perfect man if you could distinguish between the quality and the thing itself. It is not so easy as that. So it's a really good point. People still say that, oh, we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. And further, the calmer you are, and the less disturbed in your nerves, the more you will love, and the better will be your work. And one thing I love about Swami Vivekananda, and I often mention this, he always comes back to love. So at the last words of this class, he comes back to love. The calmer you are, the more you will love, and the better will be your work. I think it's well to consider this talk. He's talked so much about fanaticism, and I think it's a good caution for us. I think if we look at our own minds, at least I know if I look at my own mind, I can see certain fanatical tendencies in me. And I think probably most of us may have some fanatical tendencies. We want things to be perfect. Even in the monastery, we think should be nice. It should be perfect here. It's not going to be perfect. It can't be perfect. And the fanatic says, well, drive him out. If he's not going to do the right thing, drive him out. Where's the love then? Where's the love? Swami Vivekananda says, why do you see this problem? If you're a Vedantist, you should ask yourself, why do I see this? Why can I not can I not solve this issue, this problem? Why can I not address this through love? So he talks quite a bit about fanaticism also in Bhakti Yoga. The very beginning of Bhakti Yoga, he addresses fanaticism. And I thought I would read a few lines. Swamiji was talking about fanaticism from day one. His debut on the world stage, September 11, 1893, at the World's Parliament of Religions. How does he close his remarks? Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant, fanaticism, have long possessed this beautiful earth. They have filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. So he starts out his message, the first words of his message delivered in 1893 at the Parliament, he's condemning fanaticism. And then he says, but their time is come. And I fervently hope that the bell that tolled this morning in honor of this convention may be the death knell of all fanaticism, of all persecutions with the sword or with the pen, and of all uncharitable feelings between persons wending their way to the same goal. Beautiful. And then in Bhakti Yoga, which also was being taught at the same time in New York, he gives this caution. And really, we should remember this. The one great advantage of bhakti is that it is the easiest and the most natural way to reach the great divine end in view. And its great disadvantage is that in its lower forms, it oftentimes degenerates into hideous fanaticism. The fanatical crew, I love the way he puts that. The fanatical crew in Hinduism or Islam or Christianity have always been almost exclusively recruited from these worshippers on the lower planes of bhakti. That singleness of attachment, that nishtha, we need nishtha in bhakti. We need to be totally dedicated to our ideal, to love God fully, totally. So that singleness of attachment to a loved object, without which no genuine love can grow, is very often also the cause of the denunciation of everything else. As if to love God, I have to hate everyone who doesn't love my version of God, my idea of God. All the weak and undeveloped minds in every religion or country have only one way of loving their own ideal, and that is by hating every other ideal. So here he traces fanaticism to what? Mental weakness. Mental weakness. Undeveloped minds. Weak and undeveloped minds. Our immature mind wants everything cut and dry. We want everything clear. There's good and there's evil, and we are going to be all good and shun all evil. There's white and there's black, and we have no room for gray. That's the undeveloped mind, and that's what causes fanaticism. We have no room in our minds for gray. It's either all good or all bad. And that's not the way this world is, and that's not the way we are either. There's a little bit of wickedness in every heart. There's a little bit of the murderer in every heart. So the fanatic says, kill all the murderers. And then, of course, becoming a murderer himself. So this gray, this world is a mix. It's a gray. It's a mix of white and black. It's gray. It's a mix of red and blue. And that is purple. Actually, that's a much better way of thinking of it, because purple is beautiful. It's the color of royalty. Is that a purple?
Yeah, that's purple.
You're wearing purple. So this world is not, it's not that all red is good and blue is bad, or vice versa. It's both red and blue, and we have, from the two extremes, we have all the different manifestations and permutations, and it becomes purple, which is beautiful. And so he says, Swamiji says, this kind of love is somewhat like the canine instinct of guarding the master's property from intrusion. A dog will bark furiously when, at least the kind of protective dog, will bark furiously at anyone who comes to his or her master's home. Only, and this is quite funny, the instinct of the dog is better than the reason of man. For the dog never mistakes its master for an enemy in whatever dress he may come before it. That's beautiful. We have, God comes to us in so many forms. But unless God comes in our particular form, we bark like the dog. It's the same God. So that's a beautiful way of putting it, and funny. And it's true, the same person who is kind, good, honest, and loving to people of his own opinion will not hesitate to do the vilest deeds when they are directed against persons beyond the pale of his own religious brotherhood. Reminds me of an interesting conversation I had with a Danish man who had come to America and traveled all over as a kind of a wandering hippie. This was when I was in college in the 1980s, and he was kind of hippie-like. He had a long hair and a long braid, and even his beard was braided. He had a long beard, and it was braided, and he looked very peculiar, I should say. But so he came to America not knowing anything about America, and he went to the South, and he was taken in by some very poor African-American family there, a farming family, and got to know them, and he didn't, not growing up in America, he didn't have any sort of inbred racism. So he had a very positive experience among African Americans in the South. And then he also was taken in by some white Americans who happened to be Klansmen, members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he got to know them also very well. And what he told me, and it boggled my mind, was he told me that they were among the most loving people he had ever gotten to know among themselves. And this is exactly what Swamiji is saying right here. The same man who is kind, good, honest, and loving to people of his own opinion will not hesitate to do the vilest deeds when they are directed against persons beyond the pale of their own religious brotherhood or their own horizon. So these people, actually, what it does show is that there's hope, because even people espousing such a horrible philosophy of hate do have love in their hearts, because they're very loving in their families. And this Dane told me that. It was really quite shocking to hear, and it may be why it's so persistent, because among their little in-group, they're very supportive and loving. But it's a strange mix of, on the one hand, love for each other and hatred for anyone who is different from them. So Swami Vivekananda reminds us that our devotion will ripen, our hearts will ripen, and we must pass into that form of devotion which is called supreme. that supreme devotion where there is no more any fear of these hideous manifestations of fanaticism. The soul is overpowered by bhakti. We come too close, we come too near to the God of love to be an instrument of hatred, an instrument for the diffusion of hatred. We can only love. The closer we come to God, the closer we come to the divine, the closer we come to true love, which is the Lord Himself. So let's stop there. Let's take, we've completed the third beginner's class of Karma Yoga, for third class for beginners. Are there any questions? Oh, there is one question online. Shall we take it? Can a human control all of his urges? Some tendencies are so deep-rooted and so strong that in spite of knowing they are wrong, man can't resist it. How to rectify such tendencies? True. That's why there's so much difficulty in overcoming addiction and all that. But it's really, the first step is recognizing, right? In the 12 steps also, they take that first step. I recognize that I'm powerless and seek divine aid. So we recognize, if we have to recognize, the first step is recognizing we have a flaw that, or something in our character that we need to overcome. We have to recognize that first, and then that's the first step. Once we take that first step towards God, God takes 10 steps towards us, or 100 steps, or even 100,000 steps, says Swami Brahmananda. I can't hear you. Okay, that's a beautiful point.
Counteract it, because it's like Tagore said, like the further that you walk toward the east, like to the west, like, or either way, the further you go west, like the further the east falls behind, right?
Yes. So let me say it again. Let me say it again because nobody can hear you. I mean, the people won't have heard that, which is that whether you can. There's one approach is to fixate on the problem and address the problem. The other is, as Sri Ramakrishna says, the further you go towards the west, the further the east falls behind. So move towards God, and the more we move towards God, the more, the further our difficulties fall away, and the more we come close to the God of love, the more that drives all the hatred out of our hearts. I think we can stop here, as it's already 8:34. We'll take a moment of silence to reflect on our readings. Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma mritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. From the unreal, lead us to the real. From darkness, lead us unto light. From death, lead us to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. actually a subject we could go into further, this fanaticism. So look at Sri Ramakrishna in his period of spiritual practice. How intense. Some people would call that fanatical, but it's a different kind of thing. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you the karma yoga of Swami Vivekananda.